Candis, thanks for joining us. How does what is happening now fit into a larger narrative about news media as an institution?
Well, the news industry has very low representation of Indigenous people, except for APTN News, of course. But if you look at CBC numbers of diversity and equity, you see that their last report in 2018 only had about just over 2% of their employees were Indigenous. So there's a long ways to go for most organizations, and unbelievably, like CBC is probably further ahead than many of the private broadcasters.
What are the risks for individual journalists who do speak up?
Well, it's high stakes, right? The media industry depends on your social network, on your reputation. So speaking up has stakes not only for your current situation, but any future work that you might want to undertake. At the same time, it's enormously courageous, and certainly this isn't the first time that either an Indigenous person or a Black person or someone from another community of color has spoken up on these kinds of issues. But I think this is a real powerful intervention at this particular time.
As you say, it's not the first time, but why do you think it is happening right now?
Well, I think there is a conversation that is emerging, certainly that's related to what's been happening with Black Lives Matter and with the Black community, and the many things that are also happening in Indigenous communities. So I think there's a higher stakes to the kinds of coverage that media is giving to Indigenous and to Black issues. And I think it's really important that in the statement that was made, both of those communities are represented and discussed. I mean, the lack of representation in newsrooms of both Indigenous and Black employees is been a problem for a long time, and scholars and journalists have been talking about it.
Candis, what can newsroom bosses, those in charge, do to change this culture?
Well, you'd think that with all of the attention paid to diversity and equity, certainly by our public broadcaster, but also by many other news organizations, that there would be a lot more movement. So I think this is a moment to really think about what those initiatives have done and not done. Think about the way that journalism is practiced and whether or not newsrooms are welcome and open to Indigenous ideas, Indigenous frameworks for analysis, and the work of Indigenous journalists that are connected to their communities and accountable to their communities is quite different than it is for many of the non-Indigenous journalists.
Lots of this covered in your new book, and Candis, appreciate you joining us here today to talk about it.
Thanks for having me.